testing out new material. So I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't even know if we're going to fit the whole thing in 45 minutes. No clue. So we'll just get started. And see, I'm already like starting out with way too far into the talk. It's actually the end. Spoilers. Okay, so the original, see, I'm even changing the title on the fly, but how do I convince my boss overcoming bias to advocate for change? So I am David Dylan Thomas. I've written a book called Design for Cognitive Bias. You should go out and get it. At least I think you should. And the inspiration for this talk is that I go to a lot of conferences and see a lot of talks. And the one question I can guarantee will be in the Q&A session of any talk is some version of, that all sounds awesome, but how do I convince my boss? I've seen this at the ends of my talks, of other people's talks. It's pretty guaranteed. And I thought, well, why don't I just give a talk about that and just kind of head that off at the curb? So I get this question so much, I literally wrote a whole chapter about it in my book. And it's a chapter about stakeholder bias. And when I say stakeholder, I basically mean people who decide how we spend our time. So this could be our boss, this could be our client, this could be our boss's boss, and everybody answers to somebody. So this isn't just for like frontline or entry-level work. This could be at any point in your career, there's somebody you have to make happy, or somebody who has some limitations on what you do or don't get to do. And stakeholders and organizations will sometimes make choices we find maybe questionable, right? And it could be anything from deciding that baristas should have conversations with their customers about race for no reason, or even that people should create, oh, I don't know, 2 million fake accounts for their customers, just because. And our reaction is often something in the neighborhood of this. So what I want to talk about today is how we go from this reaction to actually advocating for change. And the thing we need to understand is, like all people, our stakeholders are making something like 95% of their decisions below the threshold of conscious thought. They are biased, right? Some of this autopilot will lead to error. We call those errors biases. Our stakeholders are no different. And the organizations we work for are no different. Organizations can have a lot of the same biases as people because they are made up of people. And so if we want to advocate for change in these organizations, we kind of need to know what's going on in that 95%. And I kind of want to give you an idea of at least some of that today. Also, we have the wonderful thing where Google Slides likes to say, oh, I'm not going to go to the next slide. I'm going to let you click a couple times. All right. So here are a few of the things we're going to cover today. One is the moral hazard of gameplay. I'll tell you what that is in a sec. We're also going to talk about status quo bias, which is the whole like the devil you know, and why people don't want to change. The sunk cost fallacy. Oh, we've spent so much on this already. Why don't we just keep spending more? Hyperbolic discounting, which is basically why so many organizations take a remarkably short-term view of the future. And loss aversion, which is a very big one and has a lot to do with risk. So we're going to cover each of these in drips and drabs as we go through. But the one I want to start with is the moral hazard of gameplay. And to describe it, I want to tell you the story of the slide deck that wouldn't go forward, of the little AI that could. All right, so once upon a time, there was an AI and it was given a very simple, well, it was given a task. And the task was to take a satellite image, turn it into a Google Map sort of image, take that Google Map sort of image and turn it back into a satellite image, or what looked like a satellite image. And what it was being judged on was how close that final image was to the original image, right? How good was it at taking that Google Map image and then turning it into a realistic satellite image? Now remember that part because it's very important. What they found was that the satellite image, the second one, the final one, was remarkably close. Like this AI was doing an amazing job, kind of too good a job. Like if there were streetlights in the original satellite image, they would show up again in the final image, which is interesting given that there was no way to see streetlights in the Google Map version of that image. So when they looked under the hood, they realized what the AI was doing was it was taking all the data from the satellite image, hiding it in the Google image, and then finding it again when it came time to create the satellite image. Now, You might call that cheating, or you might say the computer was doing exactly what it was told because it was being judged on, remember, how close that final image was to the first image. Well, if you want me to accomplish that task, the best way for me to do it is to preserve that data. So it basically invented steganography, the art of hiding images inside of other images, in order to complete the task, which I think is pretty impressive. There's another example of this from a AI project, a pretty old one called Polyworld, right? And with Polyworld, they were basically creating this sort of organic AI life form that would resemble all of the sort of activities a living thing would do, like killing and mating and growing and et cetera, right? And they just wanted to see what would happen if they gave it, all these rules. And again, the task, right? What they were telling it to do was optimize for energy efficiency, right? So do as many things that get you energy and as few things that expend energy, right? So optimize for energy. What they found was that a whole bunch of these little AIs would get together and mate, kind of have a little AI orgy, have a whole bunch of kids, and then eat them immediately. What they discovered was that they had decided that mating took energy, but having kids did not, and eating gave you energy. So by making that little rule, they had given all of these organisms a free source of energy, namely childbirth. And one of the people actually working on this said this quote, "It had not occurred to me that having a child would cost energy. That's my male bias." And as you might imagine, it was an all male team, not one of whom occurred to them, oh yeah, giving birth actually requires energy. They fixed that bug later. But again, this apparently horrific behavior was really just the computer doing exactly what it was told. And this is what brings us to the moral hazard of gameplay, which is basically this idea that there's a disconnect between what you actually want and what you're incentivizing, right? What you are rewarding. So if we think about whatever the next slide is, if we think about school, it's another good example of this, right? The goal of school is to learn. Like I'm sending you there, I want you to learn. But what we're rewarding is getting an A, right? That's what we're going to look at to decide what college you go to. How many A's did you get, right? Problem is, I can get an A without learning. It's called cheating, right? Another way to set that up might be to say, okay, I'm not going to let you advance to the next grade until you can teach what you learned to somebody else, right? Because then what I'm rewarding is the actual behavior, right? Or I could say, I'm going to give you a project and you're not going to be able to complete the project unless you've actually learned these different skills. So school in West Philadelphia beat out MIT and a whole bunch of other really smarty pants schools building, I think it was an electric car, a fuel efficient car, in their off hours. Now, you're not going to complete that task lest you learn engineering, lest you learn math, right? And I will have a much better idea if you have learned those things watching you build a car than watching you take a test. Now, we see what happens when we're not so great about setting incentives, right? Why would someone decide it's a good idea to set up 2 million fake accounts? Oh, because you're being rewarded for it, right? You're meeting sales quota and earning incentives, right? That's what I'm rewarding. Same thing, they actually did a study around all this because it happens so often. And I love this line here. They're basically saying that, like, you can have all the culture you want, but if you reward employees for achieving a metric without regard to the actions they took to achieve that metric, okay, you get the banking industry, right? And then another participant in that study had this lovable quote: "People invariably will do what you pay them to do, even when you're saying something different," right? So we need to pay very close attention to what we're actually incentivizing, right? Same thing with law enforcement, right? If you incentivize arrests, okay, well, guess what? You set up a situation where if crime goes away, that's actually bad for the officers. So what do you think happens when you get rewarded based on the number of features released, right? Well, you get that dreaded siloing that we're always talking about, right? Because now it's not in my best interest to talk to anybody else. I got to be heads down and focus on these features. In fact, it may not even be a good idea for me to do research, right? Because I'm not being rewarded on how good the features are. I'm being rewarded on how many of them there are, right? Or what if I get rewarded based on spending all of my budget, right? How many places still will say, hey, if you don't spend all your budget, you're going to get less next year, right? And so you get this slew of calls. I used to work in the AV closet of a university. And at the end of the year, I would always get this slew of calls. Oh, we need to buy all these projectors. We need to buy all this junk we don't need just so we can spend our budget to make sure we get the same budget next year. not because anyone actually needs it, right? But we're being punished, right, or rewarded for spending all of our budget. Again, this creates silos because now I got to be heads down and focused on what my division needs. And if it's a limited pool and we're basically pitting organizations within the organization against each other, you're definitely going to get siloing because budget that you get is budget that I don't get. What would happen if you got rewarded based on how much you learned, right? And even though that might not seem like an inherently good goal, right? Do you want your organization dumber at the end of the year, right? So if you're rewarded based on what you learned, all right, well then now it's actually in my best interest to collaborate with other departments because they might know something I don't know and I might know something they don't know, right? Or what would happen if you get rewarded based on general health and wellness? This has been brought up a lot of times with Facebook, that Facebook being ad-based means that they're going to get rewarded based on how many people they serve up to advertisers, right? And that's led to all sorts of, let's say, less than social behavior and ethical behavior on the part of Facebook. But what if they got, a lot of people are saying, well, what if they got rewarded based on the general health and wellness, right? Now, you might think that's really hard to measure, and it is, but it's not impossible, right? The idea of measuring this as an indicator of the actual health of a country, as a better indicator of the health of a country than GDP, has been around for at least a decade. And not for nothing, if you take a look at New Zealand's response to coronavirus in a country that is focused on health and wellness versus, oh, say, USA's response to coronavirus in a country that is based, at least in part, on the wellness of wealth, I'm going to say correlation at least, if not causation. So the other reason then it behooves us to be very careful about making sure that our goals and our incentives are aligned is that the biases that govern a project are determined at the kickoff, right? This is the moment when we do need to start advocating, right? And the reason that those biases are determined at kickoff is because that's when we're setting our goals. That's when we're deciding what success looks like. And in a very concrete way, and this is for the project managers in the room, the biases that inform your goals govern how risk is going to be viewed for the rest of that project, right? And part of the art of project management is the governing of risk, right? So if you decide that this is not a success unless we come in under budget, okay, guess what I'm looking at for every single day for the rest of the project? Where's our budget? What's our burn rate? How much money do we have left? How much money have we spent? Every single day I've got my eye on that because that's how we've defined success. Or if we say that this is not a success unless it comes in on time, okay, guess what I'm looking at every single day? What's our burn rate? How many days do we have left? How many days? How much still needs to get done? How much time have we spent, right? How can we come in sooner, right? If I decide that the goal is based on something else, all right, that's where I'm going to put the focus. That's where I'm going to put the risk. And that's going to define behavior, right, for the rest of that project. Now, this can have a really powerful impact. I was working with a pharmaceutical company once, and we went through an exercise at Kickoff to determine what the goals of the project were. And we tried to tie that to the goals of the organization. Now, to their credit, when we asked you, okay, what's your highest goal? What is your mission? They didn't say make money. They said improve health outcomes. Now, if that's the case, that gives us this powerful tool to use in negotiations later, right? So if we're having problems with the legal department, because the legal department says, oh, we're going to make it take 6 months to make one single change to the website, right? We can go to them and say, okay, what is your job, right? Legal department can say, well, our job is to keep us from getting sued. And we could say, okay, that's reasonable. But remember when we said our goal, our mission here was to improve health outcomes? Okay, we can't do that if we're sued, fair. But we also can't do it if it takes 6 months to make a change to the website. So meet me halfway. Then we could also go to like the brand agencies who are creating these product pages with all this weird like people walking through clouds or running through fields at the top of the page that was making it hard for doctors to find the information they need and driving the legal department crazy. And we could go to them and say, hey, what's your job? And they could say, well, to sell the product. And we could say, fair, but what if I told you, remember when we talked about how our goal here was to improve health outcomes? Well, fair, we can't do that unless we're selling products, but we also can't do it if like the doctors can't actually find the information they need. So meet me halfway, right? So setting that goal in a way that makes sense becomes this really powerful tool for negotiation later. Now, a beautiful example of this comes from a foundation I used to work for, and the founder was very interested in thrift. That was one of the founder's goals. Part of the charter was we want people to act more thriftily. And so down the hall, this one group came up with Thrift Store Runway. And Thrift Store Runway, it's just a Tumblr, right? It's a whole bunch of pictures sent in by users of themselves wearing looks that they created at thrift stores for under $50, right? That's the whole premise. And every month you pick a winner who gets to go on a runway with their look. Now think about the three problems this solves. One, from a content perspective, I don't have to create any content, right? I just have to curate it, right? The users are creating the content. Two, it is actually getting people to do the thing, right? I want them acting more thriftily. Okay, this is them going out and buying, looks at stores, at thrift stores for less than $50, right? But then the beauty part is when the people come back, the people who are invested in this foundation come back and say, hey, are you guys actually doing the thing, right? We could say, oh, glad you asked. Here's page after page after page and picture after picture of people actually acting more thriftily, right? It is a self-measuring content strategy. It is this perfect alignment of the goal and the metric. But that's the level you want to play at if you want to avoid the moral hazard of gameplay. Now, there's a great law that somebody made for called Goodhearts Law. And the way Marilyn Strathern puts it is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Why? Because once it's a target, I'm no longer interested in whatever the measure was supposed to achieve. I'm just interested in that target, right? And this could lead to a lot of really sketchy behavior. So without going too far into it, there is, let's say, controversy as to the efficacy of online ads, right? Because of something called selection effects. And the basic idea is that if I had a pizza store and I were to give a whole bunch of people coupons and say, go out and give out these coupons, whoever sells the most coupons wins, or gives out the most coupons wins. And this one person comes back to me and they've given away all of their coupons. And I ask her, how did you do it? And she says, oh, I just stood in the pizza line, right? So if I am buying ads on Google, how do I know that people are finding my site simply because the ads are there? How do I know they wouldn't have found my site if I hadn't just, used search, right? And what they found, because no one has actually, deliberately done the math, but there came this moment when Google, I think it was Google or Bing, was having a fight. It was Google, yeah. Google was having a fight with eBay. And eBay said, well, we're not going to buy your ads for a couple of weeks. Okay, in that time became this magic moment to test and see, okay, what happens when those ads are no longer there? Do as many people find us? And if you look at the graph, it's literally like the same number of people who are finding them through ads drops. The same amount that it drops is the same amount that the people finding them organically goes up. And it's like you've been wasting like millions of dollars a year. What did they do when all of this came out? They just went back to buying more ads. And part of the problem is it's not in the best interest of the people selling the ads to say this doesn't work, nor is it in the best interest of the people who are getting a marketing budget to buy the ads to say it doesn't work. So it is in no one's best interest to actually say something's wrong, which again is a result of the metrics, what they're being judged on. Now, I have a similar law that says there's an inverse relationship between the value of a metric and how easy that metric is to measure, right? So if I do say, hey, health and well-being, that's a really good thing to measure. Guess what? It's really hard to measure. Clicks are easy to measure. Please, can we just make that the thing we're judged on? Because it's so easy to measure. There we go. One of the things I think is helpful in trying to avoid really get everyone grounded when it comes to metrics and goals is something I call it's an objective matrix. I actually learned about it from a couple of analytics folks. And it's this basic idea of just literally writing down, what are the goals of this thing? What are the objectives that ladder up to those goals? What are the strategies that ladder up to those metrics and so on? And this is super embarrassing. This is what I wrote for myself when I was laid up after a hernia surgery and had nothing else to do. And I'm like, I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing. So if you look at the high goal of like become my best self, the objectives under that might be have fun, make people happy. And then the strategies under that might be, okay, well, how am I going to have fun? Do things that I enjoy. And then the tactic, right? The actual measurable thing might be, oh, I might give talks or I might make movies, right? But if you have a company do this at the beginning of a project, you move from this place of let's just release features for the sake of releasing features to before you release the feature, tell me where it fits into this, right? Is it helping us have fun? Is it helping us make people happy, right? Tell me why we're doing it, right? Or if you want to say, hey, we don't have time for that one anymore, great. If we're removing the provide assets from talks, okay, how else are we going to provide useful things, right? But it gives you a thing to be beholden to outside of yourself, so you can have these conversations a little more easily. Another bias you might find organizations falling into is called hyperbolic discounting. And it has to do with why we're really bad at thinking about our future selves. It's why it's really hard for us to invest money. It's why it's really hard for us to diet, because it's very easy for us to think about how good it feels to eat that cake right now. It's really hard for us to think about how that cake might make it harder for us to, deal with blood sugar 2 years from now. And with companies too, you see companies making very short-sighted decisions that really only think about maybe the next quarter, maybe the next year, right? But don't really think too far down the road. And it's interesting. What we've learned is that if you can get people to think about, relate to their future selves, they tend to make better decisions. So there's literally an experiment where you have people stand in front of a mirror, and that mirror makes them look older, right? You have that aging technology. It basically shows them back their older selves. So you have a control group that just sees themselves in the mirror, and you have another group that sees this older version of themselves in the mirror. And then when you have the older version, people sit down and make investment decisions, they invest more money, right? Because now they can relate to their older selves better. Similar to some Asian languages that don't use future tense the same way. I think Chinese is like this. So instead of saying, Thursday, I will go to the store, what you're transliterally saying is Thursday, I am at the store, right? Which is a much more present place to be. And again, you find some of the cultures that use that language from birth, right, are making better investing decisions, better eating decisions, and so on and so on. So how do we get our organizations to think more about the future? Well, we literally, when we're doing that goal setting, one of my favorite exercises to set goals and set metrics is say, hey, this thing we're working on, if it works, how will things be different a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? And whatever that is, we can then measure back to saying, oh, okay, well, if that's what we want, okay, this is what we need to start measuring now, right? This is what we need to start getting a baseline for now. So do what you can to get them to see their older selves in the mirror, so to speak. So can I get a time check, Meg? How much time do we have left?
Mute myself. It's 10:40 now, so you have about 20 minutes left.
All right, excellent. And whatever we don't get to in like question wise here, we'll be in the Discord. We'll be in the Discord later. Okay, so I want to talk about literally how do we Jedi mind trick our bosses. So there's this thing called the illusion of transparency you need to know about first off. When you are presenting to a client, to your boss, you don't need to be quite as nervous as you think. Illusion of transparency is this idea that we are not so see-through as we think. We think that everyone can tell how nervous we are when we're doing things. And the fact of the matter is, by and large, they have no idea. There's an experiment where you have a whole bunch of people on a stage and you tell some of them to lie. And then you ask them later, hey, do you think the people in the audience knew you were lying? And most of them will say, oh yeah, it was obvious. I was sweating. Oh, it was so clear. But then you ask the people in the audience, could you tell who was lying? And they're no better at chance at guessing who was lying. They have no idea, right? So when you're doing that thing and you're presenting, like, do not think people know how nervous you are. They just don't. And this, by the way, is the one bias where knowing about the bias will help. Most biases, if you know about them, you'll still doing them. This is the one bias where they've seen in experiments, if they tell people about this bias before they go on stage, they actually perform better. Another thing, and this is especially if you have to present a design or an idea to make you less nervous, don't think about it you're walking into a room to be judged. Think about it like research. And those of you familiar with UX research, this should be nothing new. You're not there to get a judgment on yourself. You're there to find out how they react to this thing you're showing them. It's like a Rorschach test, right? All I'm doing is gathering information on their reaction to this thing so I know whether we're getting closer or further away from the solution. That depersonalizes it a bit and lets you kind of be, especially if you're used to research, in your zone, right? In a comfort zone around presenting, because you're not presenting anymore. You're just getting information. You're just conducting research. Another trick I like to use is called stakeholder inception. And the basic idea is that if I give you an idea and you like it, that's great. But if the going gets rough, you can always throw that idea away because it's not your idea, it's my idea. It's better if I can get you to think that my idea was actually your idea all along. It's not quite as creepy as it sounds. I'll give you an example. So we had a client who was convinced that they had content that absolutely had to stay behind a paywall. And no matter amount of evidence we could show them that people weren't buying it, that it wasn't actually moving the needle for them in the analytics, like no amount of evidence would convince them. So we decided to do a exercise where we said, okay, I want you all to get in a room and tell us why you're making this content. Give us the top 10 reasons you're making this content that's going behind a paywall. And then we said, hey, we've done all this research and these are the top 10 reasons your users are looking for that content. Okay, now we're going to do an exercise, a brainstorm, where I want you to come up with a way to use content to make these two lists happy, right? Just go off on your own, come up with something, inventive. And by the end of that exercise, one of the things they came up with was, well, what if we took this content that's behind a paywall and we pulled it out from the paywall? And we said, that is a great idea that you had. Great idea. Congratulations. I think we should do that, right? And now they own that idea. They're not going to abandon it. And when the going gets rough, because they own it, right? And it's a more honest, right, process, because We gave them the exact same data we had to work with. And instead of telling them what it meant, we let them figure out what it meant. The piece of advice, probably the best piece of management consulting advice I ever got, was a guy named Don Bridges who said, if you ever have to make a business case, find out how upper management is compensated, right? How are they getting that bonus, right? What's standing in the way of them getting that, right? What is going to give them a good or a bad performance review, right? And the reason you want to know this is they may be making decisions that make no sense to you, but if you understood what was driving them and what problem they were thinking about before you walked in the room, it would be crystal clear why they don't want to do research, why they, suddenly object to this governance meeting that you were having, right? But usually that isn't clear to us. So try to come up with an understanding of that. And then when you are pitching whatever it is that you think we should be doing, you can pitch it in terms of their problem, not yours, because even if they care about your problem, they don't care about it as much as they care about their problem. Like, that's not, your problem is not what they've been thinking about, unless they're a really good leader. Your problem is not what they've been thinking about most of this time, right? But if you come in and say, hey, I figured out a way for you to get that bonus, okay, now they're paying attention. And this means you need to really hear your stakeholder. And we'll talk a little more about this at the end. And the reason that, I'll give you an example of how helpful it can be to really hear what's going on. So we had a project where we had to help a client come up with a taxonomy. And we kept running into interference every single step of the way. Like, just no one wanted to move forward. And when we finally gained the client's trust, we were able to suss out that there was a war that we had stepped into between the technologists who had to implement the taxonomy and the content team who had to create it. There was basically a whole lot of bad blood, because the last time they tried this, a whole bunch of people got screwed over. So what we needed to do wasn't to, do some research and go in a corner and do a taxonomy and then present it. What we needed to do was have everybody in the room together and doing the taxonomy at the same time as a working meeting, because that way everybody could see everybody else. And more importantly, at the beginning of every meeting, we could have the airing of grievances, because that's really what people needed to do before they could proceed, was to sort of get all that out. Right. So we were really more marriage counselors than taxonomists at that point, but that's what the client actually needed. Once we understood that, we could work in a way that allowed us to move forward. So another very key thing that you'll run into, especially at very risk averse, which usually is just another word for large or expensive organizations, is loss aversion. And loss aversion is basically the concept that it hurts twice as much to lose something as it feels good to gain something, right? So it hurts twice as much to lose $10 as it feels good to just find $10 lying on the street. And I recently saw a really interesting version of this, right? So those of you familiar with Hamilton, right? Hamilton's key song in the musical is My Shot. It's all about being ambitious and going for it and not waiting, right? Aaron Burr's key song is Wait For It. It's all about being cautious and holding back. And when they talked to Lin-Manuel Miranda about the writing of Wait For It, he said, okay, I understood Aaron Burr when I understood that the key difference is they were both orphans, but Hamilton was poor. He had nothing to lose. Burr came from an enormous amount of wealth, and he had a lot to lose. He had his whole family's legacy to lose. So he was very cautious. He was concerned about what he had to lose. And we can think about our organizations that way, right? And when we talk about status quo bias, when we talk about sunk cost fallacy, that's just another version of loss aversion. I'm afraid of losing what I have, the comfort of knowing how things work now, right? The comfort of knowing that I've spent all this money on this one thing, and therefore I have to be right. Now, what this does in terms of helping people arrive at decisions is how we frame the decision we want them to make. And people who are risk averse, it's generally a better idea to paint a negative picture of not taking the risk than the positive picture of taking the risk. And so an example might be you have a boss or a client who has this crappy CMS that nobody likes, and everybody knows it sucks. And you could go in and say, hey, I've got this bright, shiny new CMS. And if we use it, everyone's going to be happy. And we're going to make all this money. And unicorns are going to walk down the hallway. And what's actually more convincing most of the time is to go in and say, hey, if we keep using this crappy CMS, here's how many people are going to quit. Here's how much money we're going to lose. Here's how much productivity is going to go down while we're searching for their replacements and retraining their replacements, which is also going to be expensive, by the way, right? Painting that apocalyptic picture makes that risk seem less risky, right? Than painting some positive picture where they're like, yeah, but I don't know. And the way I think about it is I'm kind of a homebody, And if you were to say, Dave, it's a beautiful day outside, don't you want to go outside? I might be like, oh, maybe, right? That's painting the positive picture of the outside. If on the other hand, you say, hey, Dave, you know the house is on fire, right? Oh, yeah, I'm going for the door, right? Another thing you have to think about is even the time of day. So there's a thing called decision fatigue. And the basic idea is that making decisions, especially tough decision, actually takes physical energy, right? The more you do it, the more exhausted you get. And the more decisions you make, the worse those decisions are going to be, the less quality they're going to be, the more conservative they'll be. And let me give you the most frightening possible example of this, the judicial system. They took a look at judges' decisions throughout the day, and this is from an abstract of one of the times they've done this. We recorded the judges' 2 daily food breaks, right? Segmenting the deliberations into 3 distinct decision sessions, we find that the percentage of favorable rulings drops gradually from 65% to nearly 0 within each decision session, and then returns abruptly to 65% after a break, which means the judges are getting hangry. Hanger is real, and they're making worse decisions about people's lives the hungrier they get, right? The less energy they have to make these decisions, right? So if you're ever up for a parole hearing, try to make sure it's earlier in the day. That's all I can tell you. But point is, the time of day and whether people have had food actually makes a difference to how much risk they're willing to take and the quality of the decisions they'll make. So I can tell you when we're, I work for a think company, and when we were doing in-person workshops that would last like 4 hours, we would make sure to bring cookies, right? We would make sure to bring really good food. Or if we had an all-day thing, we'd have a lunch break with really good food. It got to the point where our unofficial motto was come for the food, stay for the experience design. And I think part of the reason is like we work with a bunch of foodies, but part of the reason is that we understand that if you're getting hungry, you're getting distracted, you're not making good decisions anymore. Even the day of the week can have an influence on all of this. So there's some research out of the London School of Economics looking at what they call the weekly cycle. And the idea is that risk tolerance drops throughout the week and then returns abruptly at the end of the week, right? And they see this across different kinds of decisions, whether or not to go to the hospital, who to vote for, even whether or not to rob a bank. They see the same curve over and over again, right? So even if it comes down to things like, if you are going in to your boss and you're having to ask them to make a fairly risky decision, make sure to do it probably on a Monday or a Friday, and preferably after they've had a really nice meal. Another bias that you can kind of take advantage of here is called consistency bias. And it's when you're trying to introduce something that's going to involve multiple steps, right? So for example, I'm rolling out inclusive design where I'm advising on rolling out inclusive design or other organizations. And what I advise is start with something small, right? So there's a thing called an assumption audit, and it's basically a 2-hour meeting at the beginning of a project to help you assess the bias that your team might be bringing to the project. It's like a 2-hour meeting. And I say, hey, start out and just say to the person holding the purse strings, can I just get this 2-hour meeting added to the budget? It's a 60-day project. 2 hours is not even gonna, just please, right? Then if that's worked out a couple times and it's maybe in the template for the budget now, right? I can come back and say, oh, I'd like to do a red team, blue team exercise. And this is a thing that takes about a day where you bring in a whole other team to come in and assess the work for bias, right? Now that's a whole day, but I've already gotten you to agree to 2 hours. And the reason that tends to work is because of consistency bias. We like to feel we are congruent with the decisions we've made in the past. So here's an actual experiment. You go to someone and say, hey, can I put this big honking sign on your lawn? They'll say no, right? But if I go up and I say, hey, can I put this just tiny, you won't even, just this little sign, can I put it on your lawn? They're more likely to say yes. If they say yes, and I come back 2-3 weeks later and say, hey, can I put this big honking sign on your lawn? They're more likely to say yes because they're sign people now. Same thing with inclusive design, right? I come in and I say, hey, can I get this 2-hour thing? Come back later, ask for a whole day. Well, I guess we're an inclusive design shop now. Final lesson, people need to feel heard. I was talking to Christina Halverson about this, and what she said was that if I'm talking to somebody, especially somebody in power, people in power are used to being heard. And I get that it's very power elite, but the fact of the matter is everybody needs to feel heard. And if you're trying to convince somebody of something, right, and they don't feel heard, they're not going to listen to a single word you say, because if people don't feel heard, they don't feel respected. If people don't feel you respect them, they're not going to listen. Even if you have a great idea, they're not going to listen to you because you're not feeding this core emotional need that people have to actually feel dignity. So I am, and so let me preface this by saying I've made the horrible life choice of including video and audio in my talk. So fingers crossed. But when I start this, just give me a big thumbs up if you can actually hear and see it. And if not, give me a thumbs up down. I'll try to sum it up. But this is someone who I think I cannot sum them up better than they can say themselves.
And so part of it is like emotional work, and the second part of it is intention. Like, what are you trying to get out of this conversation? And if you're just trying to argue with someone, it's not going to work. You know, you believe what you believe, they believe what they believe. So I think the thing that we have to do is try to have a good faith interaction of trying to learn more about where the other person comes from. Because often what I find is that when I do win people over, it's almost never in the conversation itself that I've won someone over. It's that I have a conversation with someone, I ask them some critical questions, and I pretty calmly explain to them, well, this is where I'm coming from, and this is why I believe what I believe. Why do you believe what you believe? And you kind of like leave the conversation, but very often that person will sit on what you said. And they will sit on the fact that you respected them and gave them space. And then very often, I've had interactions like that, and I'll run into that person again a week later, a month later, etc. And they said, you know what? You said something that I really thought about, and I changed my mind. But no one ever changes their mind in the actual acute situation of a conversation. It's like afterwards, when it kind of sits with them. But if you rush in, you know, fully armored up, attacking them and making them feel defensive, they will never listen to anything that you have to say. So it's really about learning how we can have a conversation again. And also there's a really important conversation about good faith and bad faith conversations. And when I sense that someone is engaging in me in bad faith, I just don't engage the conversation at all. It's not worth my time or my energy. If someone's trying to put you down or belittle you or approach a conversation as though they are more intelligent than you, because like, oh no, there's no way that someone can disagree with me and still be smart. You know, there's this like, there's this very condescending tone that we have in a lot of our conversations. And I think it's important to really approach those kinds of disagreements with a lot of compassion, because when they see that, people really look at not just the logic of your argument, but how you make them feel. As much as people hate to say that and admit it, it's true.
All right, so we're going to see if I can move to the next slide without starting the thing again. No,
and so part of it is like emotional work. And
go to the next slide. There we go. So like I said, I can't say that better than she does, but that's the point, right? Whatever of all these different things I'm recommending, you need to consider the feelings of the person you're talking to. It doesn't sound like a very professional business thing, but it's true. It's how we make decisions. Final thing I want to bring up around that is, and to her point about, there's some people who you're never going to change their mind, right? And so you need to understand that there's a difference between changing minds and changing behavior. And more often than not, what we actually want or what we need in the moment is to change the behavior. So I'm going to give you my final story here is don't mess with Texas. Don't mess with Texas is a phrase you may have heard before. It started out as an anti-littering campaign. Texas, I think this is in the 70s, highways were horrible, right? And so they said, okay, we've tried everything. Let's try Don't Mess with Texas. And Don't Mess with Texas basically was a way of tying the act of littering to an affront to the great state of Texas. And the beauty of it was it tied into something that every single Texan could agree on. That Texas was awesome, right? Liberal or Democrat, environmentalist or not, everybody agreed that Texas was awesome. So if you can tie the act of littering to this affront to the great state of Texas, all of a sudden, even good old boys are like, what are you doing? Don't throw it, go to a trash can, right? And this actually moved the needle, something like 75% decrease in littering right now. Did they suddenly convince everybody overnight that to be environmentalists? No, absolutely not, right? Look at the voting record of Texas since then. Pretty clearly not, but did they get people to stop littering? Yes. And so you have to decide for yourself, is my goal here to change behavior or change minds? Because the tactics may sometimes be different. So we're pretty much out of time. Thank you so much. We're going to do, I don't know, like a minute of Q&A now. I at least know how long the talk is now.
Yay! Thank you, David. We have a question from Lou, if he wants to hop on.
Sure. So as Dave knows, because Dave knows me, I'm moving into a new job, and for the very first time, I'm going to be doing a news job that isn't driven by a profit motive. So like, we'll measure clicks, we'll measure all the things we always measure, and they'll inform our decisions about what we're succeeding, but they won't be the measure of it, which is great and speaks to things Dave was talking about. So potentially, like, there's a room to eliminate a lot of the toxicity in motivation and like badly set up motivation that I'm used to. I'm curious what Dave thinks about where the landmines are and like failing to internalize that, or maybe I'm already misconceptualizing it. But like it feels great. It feels like a great move. What about it should I be mindful of? Might not be, or might not be if it's not done right.
I mean, I think everyone needs to be on the same page as to who's the boss, right? So one of the beautiful things about moving away from an ad-driven, I'm assuming you're not ad-driven, moving away from an ad-driven journalism model is that you are not now beholden to or you don't have a conflict of interest between what the people need and what the advertisers need. And so if you need to do a story on an advertiser, it's not going to get weird, right? But what you do need to figure out is, I imagine, right, not having done this myself, but being adjacent to it, is advocacy, right? And where are you going to land in terms of, if you're reporting about climate change, why are we reporting about it? Are we reporting about it because we actually genuinely want people to change their behavior, or are we just objectively delivering news? And the problem, and certainly what I've seen by studying bias for 3 years, 4 years, is that objective isn't actually an option, right?
Yeah, I've given my own talks on that.
Exactly, right? I think that's where you're going to run into trouble. But I think the smart move there is to get everyone on the same page around letting that line be determined by what your goals actually are, and giving yourself some of those scenarios, like, what would we do if we had these two different ways to deliver the story, and one of them would be more likely to convince people or to behave way X versus way Y, because the fact of the matter is, any way you deliver that story is going to influence people to, on a probability scale, act more like this or more like that. I think that's where your sort of ethical landfalls are going to be. And it's going to be a lot of soul searching. And again, aligning, making sure everyone's on the same page. This is what we do in those situations.
Awesome. Everyone, I'm going to unmute all of you because I think it would be fun as the moderator for all of us to give a round of applause, or you can go like this on your screen. So I'm just going to try to unmute you guys. David, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You guys can pop out and go find your next talk. It'll start at 11:15. Thank you for being here.
I'll be in the
Thank you for the talk.
Chat.
Yeah, come over to Discord and we'll see y'all there.
Oh, and at 11:15, Marta's talking about dismantling the patriarchy. You should go.
Thanks, everyone.